Welcome back to our third session as we look together at this wonderful book of Hosea. And one thing I would mention to you as we keep getting further and further into this book is I would encourage you to think about your own history as a Christian and to ask yourself this question: how many times have I actually heard sermons from my pastor or sermons from other teachers where they actually went through a prophet, where they began in chapter 1, verse 1, and they went right through the end? And I think what you would find yourself answering in your own mind is that you have heard very few sermons on the prophets. When I think of my 40 years as a Christian, and if I was to only have gone to Sunday morning church services, that would be 2,000 sermons I had listened to. Well, I've listened to a lot more than 2,000 sermons, because not only have I gone Sunday morning, but I've often gone Sunday night. Then I've sat in on many hundreds and hundreds of SBS lectures. So I've been in thousands and thousands of teachings. Well, one of the things as I think about the church across the board is that there's not a lot of teaching and preaching on the prophets. And I think we've got to ask the question, why? Right? It's not simply that you learn to ask the question why in Bible books, but one of the things inductive Bible study does for you is it actually starts to influence the way you think about a whole lot of things. And one of the things I've asked myself is, why don't pastors preach more out of the prophets? I think the answer, and to me the answer is quite simple. Because they're so difficult and take so much work. It takes a lot of work to do the prophets correctly. And so as you are in the midst of learning the prophets, you need to understand that you are in the midst of probably what is the most difficult part of learning the Bible. And I look back on my own experience as a student. As I said to you, I had to end up teaching myself the prophets. And I went to, what arguably could have been some of the finest schools in the United States back in the day. That was back when Noah was floating his boat back in the 1970s. So as we consider this third session in Hosea, I want to just pose for you a couple more of these inductive Bible study questions that you have on your booklet that you've been given to introduce the course. And I want to ask, what is the atmosphere around the book? What is the atmosphere emotionally? What is the atmosphere spiritually? And so let's just think about this atmosphere. And as we think about atmosphere, what we're wanting to do is to capture the emotion, to capture kind of the feeling. What would the feeling around this book have been? And I want to just point out several things to you. If you look in chapter 1 and verse 2 for me. In chapter 1 and verse 2, it says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits great harlotry by forsaking the Lord." One of the things that I think is very important to consider in this book of Hosea is this book is a very personal book. And when I say personal, I'm talking about it is a book that was really involved with the life of the prophet. Now, this often happens with many of the prophets. But as I consider Hosea, in some ways, the book of Hosea could probably be way up there in the running for the most personal of all the prophetic books. That virtually everything God does and deals with here is very personal to the prophet, very personal to God. And as a result of that, you can imagine then that there was a great emotional atmosphere that was around it. It was emotional for Hosea. Just imagine yourself being Hosea when God tells you to do this. Go take a harlot for a wife. How would you have responded to that? Well, I know how I would have responded. I would have thought, but God, your word says I can't do this. But God, but God, but God. And God just very clearly said, you do this, and it's going to be an illustration to my people of what they're like to me. Very personal, very shattering in some ways. It would have probably been something that created great turmoil in Hosea's life. How do I do that? How do I talk to my friends? How do I tell my family what I'm going to do? And so as we consider this, I think we need to understand the very personal nature of this book. That this would have been a book that would have touched very deeply not only the emotions of the readers, but the emotions of Hosea himself. You look at chapter 2 and verse 5. He's talking about his children And in verse 4 he says, upon her children also I will have no pity. God's talking about his own people. Because they're children of harlotry, for their mother has played the harlot. She that conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers who gave me bread and water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. And so here we see again this very personal, very negative, very difficult nature and circumstance of this book, where God says, look, this isn't simply going to affect you, it's going to affect the children. And God says it's going to affect the children of the nation, because that's the way the nation is treating me, and their kids are going to be like this. And Hosea, this is what's going to happen. It's going to be your children. Just imagine the pain in that. And so we think about the personal nature of this book. It's just really remarkable. Chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, where God says there is stealing and lying and killing and committing adultery. Just imagine that. It says, they break all bounds, and murder follows murder. And so what God is saying here is, these people, it's just anarchy. That these people are just, they're running in every direction like a group of crazy people. And you can imagine God, and you can imagine the heartbreak of God in this, and you take that and you can see that that so parallels what would have been the heartbreak of Hosea. Running after his wife, trying to bring her back, and God just looking at his people, and it's just such a clear picture where he says they break all bounds, that there are no boundaries. They just do whatever they want to do. And God says, this is what my people are like. And in verse 3 it says, therefore the land mourns. And I think it's a very interesting picture. And it truly is a picture. It's a poetic picture, I think, of the way God feels. And it's in the land, that the land mourns. I believe that that's how God felt. He mourned. And I think this is what Hosea did. He mourned. And so we have this really personal picture. In chapter 4 and verse 13, they sacrifice on the top of the mountains, make offerings on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery. And we see again this picture that the kids are affected. Your daughters are going to act like this. And we see God just looking at this, saying, look at what you're doing, that this is utter devastation in the land. And so in 5:13 as well, Ephraim saw his sickness, Judah his wound. Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to the great king, and sent to the great king. But he is not able to cure you or heal your wound. In verse 14, I will be like a lion to Ephraim, like a young lion to the house of Judah. I will rend and go away. I will carry off, and none shall rescue. And what you see here is God recognizing, verse 13, the sickness of his people. How emotionally painful that must have been. Think about a parent as they're looking at their sick child, sick son or sick daughter, wanting to heal them, wanting to make them better. And what God points out here is they went to the wrong place to be cured. That they wouldn't run to him, they went somewhere else. And God says, I've got no choice. I can either try to allure them with love or to rend and to tear them. And he says, I'm going to tear them. And can you imagine the heartbreak, the difficulty in the heart of God doing this? And it's almost unimaginable to think what God himself must have gone through. And the only parallel we can look at is what Hosea was going through. I have a friend whose wife committed adultery on him. And it was amazing the kind of pain that went through that husband's heart. I remember one night he called me on the telephone, and it was when he knew that she was not, he'd done everything he could to bring her back, and he couldn't bring her back. And he got on the telephone with me, and I can still remember exactly where I was sitting in my house. It was such a vivid and negative situation. And this friend called me, and for 1 hour, all I listened to him do on the other end of the phone was wail over the telephone. He didn't talk. He didn't use words. All he did was wailed. And when we consider that kind of deep emotional pain and scarring that must have been in the life of Hosea, all I can think about is my friend. That my friend called me that night on the phone, and as soon as it was his turn to talk on the phone for 1 hour, I just listened to him. And this is what was in the heart of God. this incredible pain. And so we have this picture where God is doing everything He can to bring His people back. And what we don't want to do is to miss the depth of that. So we have that atmosphere, and you don't want to miss that atmosphere. As you look at Hosea, it's so easy when you start going through so many of these Bible books to simply look at this as black letters on white pages and really miss an experience, an encounter with God in this, and we don't want to miss it. So one other question that I would put before us in this inductive look at Hosea as we're just getting into it, and think about how wonderful this is. We've only gone through 7 or 8 questions. I haven't talked with you about how to do your charts. I haven't talked with you about your paragraph titles. All we've done is just ask a few questions of the text, and I want you to think about how much your looking at the book of Hosea has already been shaped by just some of the questions that we're just thinking through together. We want to think about comparisons here. What are the comparisons that Hosea makes in the book? And you will have this in your inductive Bible study introduction, either in the observation or the interpretation parts, probably an observation for you. But we want to think about some of the comparisons that Hosea makes. And in chapter 2 and verse 20, God says to His people, I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. Notice we have this whole idea of a man betrothing a woman to be his wife. And so we have the people of God here, the nation of God, being compared to a wife. And we just think about the way a man thinks about a woman when he thinks about his wife. And God says, I'm going to betroth you to me. And we think about this wonderful picture. And all through the Bible, the people of God are compared to a wife. We find in Ephesians chapter 5 that the church of God is compared to a wife, to a husband. So we have this picture. We have another comparison that's very interesting, that's rather harsh, I think, in chapter 4 and verse 16, where Hosea says, like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn. Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in a broad pasture? Notice here in verse 16, God compares himself to compares His people to 2 different kinds of animals, to a stubborn heifer and to a lamb. And one of the things that is rather harsh here in the book is the stubbornness of His people is basically compared to this stubborn heifer. And you just have a heifer that nobody can control. And He says, this is what my people are like. Now the interesting thing in that is on either side of that verse, that is 4:16, on 4:15 you have the people of God running after idols. And then in 4:17 it says Ephraim is joined to idols. And then in 4:18 a band of drunkards, they give themselves to harlotry. And so what God is saying here in 4:16, this stubborn heifer, God says, you know, my people, they are like an animal that is out of control. And imagine what a sad picture, what a sad comparison this is, that the Lord would stir Hosea up to use that as a comparison. Then there's one other one I want to point out to you that is, to me, a very sad one. Chapter 5 and verse 12, where God compares Himself. Verse 12, therefore I am like a moth to Ephraim, and like dry rot to the house of Judah. Notice what God compares Himself to. God says, I'm like a moth to these people. Well, I want you to think about a moth. Think about how you think about a moth. Usually when you think about a moth is flying around a light or else disturbing you in some way, and you do what you can to get rid of a moth, right? Because they're just a pain. And what God is saying here in chapter 5 is basically to my own people. God says, I am simply an inconvenience. I just kind of fly around. I just bug them. I bug my people. They just really don't like to have me around. But the thing that is really disturbing in this passage is down in verse 12 where He says, and like dry rot to the house of Judah. Think about dry rot in the foundation of a house, or dry rot in a wall of a house. That what you have in dry rot is something that is just absolutely worthless. And dry rot is something that you try to get rid of. You either take a hammer to it and completely take the wall down and rebuild it, or you take dry rot and you paint something over it to protect the rest of the house from it. And think about that. That God is saying, I'm like dry rot to you people. You'd like to take a sledgehammer to me and just get me out of here. Or you would like to take some paint maybe and cover me up. And when you think about that relative to the people of God at the time of Hosea, that basically they would do whatever they could to get rid of God. He was a pain. He bothered them. Or they just kind of cover him up, and he'd be like the crazy uncle that people put in the basement of their house that nobody talks about. That's what they considered God to be. He was dry rot. This is a terrible thing. And so when you consider this in the book, we understand then that this whole idea of comparisons is such a vivid way for God to communicate to us through the prophets. This is why they're so rich, is you have this great picture in Hebrew poetry. God says he's like dry rot. So as we come back in the next session, we are going to think through some of your work.